It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and your host, Chris Larry.
Hello and welcome to another episode of It's Just Business on the Hogstein Network, the show where we look at the sports, media, business, legal, industrial complex, and global economy in which it drives. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. It's another, Washington Redskins / Washington football weekend. So it's these weekends are always busy for us when we're recording multiple shows and stuff. But it's a good time. It's fun. And I told you, before, my mission this weekend is to put up Christmas lights, which I despise doing. But it's a necessary evil because it looks good.
I do enjoy lights. I have probably a similar punch list for today. So let's bask in our oasis of this hour of talking about sports and business and put
this one's
the chore
better.
List.
This week, because last show we had just a string of awful crime stories, and it was like Henry Ruggs, and we've got better stuff. We've got less humanity is awful stories today, or at least a different kind of humanity is awful, possibly.
Nobody. Let's see. I'm quickly going through. Yes, all three stories. There's no one's in real deep legal jeopardy. There's some high stakes negotiations can always take turns, but no one's looking to get their pantsuit off them or go to prison in the stories we will talk about today.
We're back to just the normal theme of this show, which is it's always about the money. That's
exactly
what today is.
So maybe with that, we'll look at how the money and how to divide it in Major League Baseball currently has that entire sport, up on blocks, up on cinder blocks, like your neighbor down the street's car.
Yeah, matter of fact, I saw 2 days ago, somebody had a big van on blocks. It's, and I don't know why anybody has a car on block, but regardless, especially a big van. So, as you know, there's a work stoppage in baseball. Now, let's be clear about what has happened. This is not a strike. A strike is where the employees refuse to show up to work. This is a lockout. And what that means is that the owners have quite literally locked the doors and told the players, don't come back until we have a collective bargaining agreement done. Now, from a practical reality standpoint, obviously nothing's going on in baseball right now. And so in terms of like what the players may be doing, working out and all that stuff, baseball players don't come to the facilities anyway during the off season. They do it all from home and stuff. So, or wherever they are. So practically from the players that are signed, it's not going to have an impact until we get to spring training. But where this lockout does have an impact is that as of now, there are no more contract negotiations. There are no more communications between players and teams, agents and teams, anything like that. So the business, the hot stove league has become, unplug the gas from the stove and it doesn't work anymore. So that's the reality of the practical nature of what's happened here is that all the signings are over. So like you saw like a string of big signings, like my beloved Dodgers were stupid and let Max Scherzer and Corey Seager go to giant contracts. And there were a couple others. Teams were scrambling to get a bunch of big name players signed because everybody knew this lockout was coming. Because the owners basically said it, we will lock you out, in so many words at least. So that was as of Thursday. And why Thursday? Well, that was because the prior collective bargaining agreement expired at midnight Wednesday. And the prior agreement was from 2016, which for reasons that probably have to do with the status of the contract negotiations at the time, they only did a 5-year deal. So that is where we are now. And so again, the teams have, 2.5 months before real stuff starts to not happen because, pitchers and catchers report in February. So that's where we are. So what are they fighting over? It's obviously money. Okay. Don't think it's anything but money. There's a whole bunch of issues. Um, and it's not so much like the NFL, it's pretty much usually the split of revenue between owners and teams. Well, baseball has a bunch of weird issues that other sports don't have. Arbitration rules, there's no salary cap. There's a whole bunch of things, but I could talk forever. I've talked for long enough. Chris, just thoughts in general about the Major League Baseball lockout?
Well, what they're pretty much everyone is identifying as that first line in the sand, which, lines in the sand are easily scrubbed over with your foot. That's the point. So, but is around February 1st. Which is when, as you said, pitchers and catchers start to show up. Spring training starts to come into focus, et cetera, et cetera. So what I think to me is this: if everything works out for both sides and baseball kicks off relatively as normal this year, and let's say that means that opening pitch is as scheduled, then I think it's because they did a bit of a planned demolition. Pretty well timed out, like a gap in their year. Yes, of course, yes, no free agency. All the stove is out back in winter. But they'll figure that out. And you're right. Your Max Scherzers of the world who got to cash in huge and remain on the top tier player negotiating team at the union. That's quite a trick. But to put that aside for a second, I think this is a planned demolition. I think they gave themselves enough time. If we see it really blow up spring training, I don't mean miss a week or two delay. I mean really blow up the grapefruit and cactus leagues. Then we know something went wrong. But I think all sides have cautious optimism that they have the time they need.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right because, everybody knew this lockout was going to happen. It was going to happen. Then in a second, the prior contract expired, and they really are giving themselves enough time to negotiate, and there's not enough good faith between the parties right now to not have a lockout, which is why there is one. But yeah, I mean, I think that it was done intentionally because, listen, I mean, yes, it's always true in sports that the owners can always outlast the players in every league because the owners don't need this, whereas the players do, to literally feed their families and whatnot. So yes, while the owners can still outlast the players, the owners have lost a lot of money recently themselves. Don't forget this. 2 seasons ago, they lost a fortune with the coronavirus cancellations and whatnot. And if you guys recall, we talked about that on the show. The negotiations between the players and owners at that time were the most contentious in any of the major American sports. Football wasn't really affected. Basketball figured out their issues pretty easily. Baseball, the players and the owners are at each other's throats. And it was all about, how much money the players are going to get per game and whatnot. And so I think there's still some animosity and maybe lingering resentment with regard to that. But yes, I think Chris is right. So what are the issues? Number one, there's a story in ESPN. If you want to read about some of the big picture issues, Jesse Rogers, dated December 2nd, 2021, everything you need to know about Major League Baseball's lockout. And he goes over a lot of what we're saying here. But in terms of the issues, obviously it's about money. The Athletic had a story about how the income for players has decreased slightly, and some of the way they did the data, they were leaving out the fact that there was one more player on the roster, a bunch of big players hadn't signed yet, so the salaries really aren't as low as they were claiming. However, they certainly haven't risen, so that's that. But the other big picture, Chris, I think is that if I were the players, what I'd be concerned about is Major League Baseball can lock up their players. Major League Baseball teams can lock up their players under team control far longer than any other sport. Far longer. There's ways to manipulate minor league service time. There's multiple years of arbitration, so these players don't become free agents until they're getting into their late 20s. And unless you're, the Clayton Kershaws of the world, you may really only be due one big contract. And if it were me and I were a player, that's what I would be most concerned about, is trying to loosen up some of the team control rules.
You want to put a fine point on that idea. Look at Juan Soto. Everyone's already talking about Juan Soto free agency. Where's he going to go? He's seen with his super agent, whatever his name is, at the World Series or at a playoff game. Then you go and check when Juan Soto's free agency year is. It's 2024. So here's a guy who, by the time 2024 rolls around, he will have been a superstar and a World Series champion, and probably, I don't know, maybe he's been already, but probably will be or be very close to an MVP in that run as well. By the time he gets an even sniff free agency.
Yeah, and Scott Boras is who you're talking
Right,
about.
right, right. Yeah,
He's the baseball, the leading agent in baseball. Well, I'll give you another example. I mean, Corey Seager is another one. The former Dodger superstar who the Dodgers should have who the Dodgers should have kept. It still bums me out. So he was drafted in the first round in 2012, made his major league debut in 2015. The Dodgers intentionally manipulated his playing time in 2015 to make sure he didn't get a good year in 2015. So they got one more year out of him, and then he ended up being the 2016 Rookie of the Year because of that. And so he just this year, 2021, hit free agency and got a gigantic contract. And listen, I mean, nobody cry for him because he's still making a lot of money, obviously. But so it took. For Corey Seager, it took 6 years to reach free agency, and he's an elite level superstar, type who got his money, and so he is 27, born April of 1994. Yeah, and so he's got 1 year. What is his contract? 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. I mean, that's probably it for him in terms of big dollars and whatnot. So that's an example. So if I were the players, what I would want to shoot for is one less year of control. And what happens in baseball, without getting too specific, is that the teams can basically send these players to arbitration. They basically make a qualifying offer, and then the players can't leave, and then they go to arbitration to determine the salary. But the players don't have an option to leave. So I think that might be my biggest issue would be to eliminate one of those arbitration years and get players to free agency 1 year sooner. I think that's probably what I would be shooting for. Thoughts?
No, I liked it. I really like that. I would see the players giving up a little. They'd be smart to, let me say, giving up a little bit of a percentage of revenue or however they're slicing, that pie to some degree for those kinds of concessions. Baseball's always the sort of slowest to modernize in terms of labor and owner practices, whether it be the salary cap or revenue sharing or some of these things. And there, as you say, there's arbitration, a lot of more older and arcane rules to all of that. So I think it always behooves the players to sort of wipe away some of those cobwebs of antiquity in terms of how baseball runs its shop.
Yeah, now there's a perception out there in the public that the Major League Baseball Players Union has been more successful than the unions of the other American sports, football and basketball, and to some extent they're right. The primary reason is that there's no hard salary cap, although in the last arbitration or CBA negotiation, the teams did institute this luxury tax, which serves as a soft cap, basically. And so they're not. I don't think that they've been as successful as possible. Because never forget this: it's the owners that want the cap. Okay, the owners want a salary cap because the owners want to have an excuse to protect themselves from themselves, and not give the Corey Seagers and Juan Sotos of the world $150 million if they don't have to. In terms of negotiations, I always like to point this out. And yes, obviously players don't have the resources that owners do, and so the average MLB player needs his paycheck. But there's more than that. If you look at the executive board of the Major League Baseball Players Union, Max Scherzer, Chris mentioned that Marcus Simeon, Garrett Cole, Francisco Lindor, Jason Castro, Zach Britton, Andrew Miller, James Paxton. Most of these guys aren't even college graduates. Okay, they're not negotiators. They're not skilled in this. They're baseball players, and I admire them for their skill. But my point is, baseball have a bunch of business guys running their union or running the league rather, and running negotiations. The players, their lead, the face of their union is Tony Clark, who's a former player himself. So I would argue that all of these unions inherently have a disadvantage in the negotiations because the players don't really know how any of this works. Even the players on the committee aren't real business guys who've been doing this. So I think these negotiations always sort of tend to favor the owners, not just for financial reasons, but because they're just better at negotiating stuff and more experienced.
Yeah, and I think to a large degree, I mean, they play a ceremonial would be not the right word, but the lawyers and the now here's where this breaks down, because normally I'd say the lawyers and whoever's the head of the baseball union, there's that council of players, and they're there basically as a voice, but not the voice, and their most important job is talking and communicating with the rank and file through the team reps, et cetera, et cetera. So, but with Tony Clark, a relative noob in terms of this, and he may come, here's his moment. If he gets the players a decent deal, then what I say might be wrong or ill-founded. But you have a relatively new person in that slot who kind of comes from that player rep mentality because he's one of the best players to ever play. So he obviously is going to come from that perspective. So that's what makes this a little interesting. Is he listening to that players' council more? Do they have more access? Normally, the real work is done by the lawyers, but usually there's a lawyer, in the head of the union.
Yeah, and remember, I mean, the lawyers for something like this are the hired hands, okay? They're not supposed to be driving the bus in terms of the negotiation, the goals, the negotiating goals. What they want, the union has to determine that. And I think sports unions in particular, maybe more than others, always have a problem in figuring out what the right goals are. Like the NFL, players union in these negotiate, and I'm no friend of unions, don't get me wrong here. But I think there's a world of difference between a real union and a union of millionaire players, okay? Have sympathy for the electrical unions. Nobody needs to have sympathy for a union of people who are averaging seven figures. That's my view of it. But regardless, like in football, the players union tends to focus on things that the owners don't care about: practice times, days off, during the season, how often they can report, to they are forced to report to the facility during the off season, that kind of thing. Owners don't care about any of that. They'll give on all of that, and because they're giving on that, that keeps the players union from. The players union have to give on big picture issues, which is money, split of revenue, and things. And so I've always thought that, especially in football, that the players tend to focus on the wrong things. Now baseball. There's some interesting points here that apparently are on the table that the owners want. One, greatly expanded postseason. The league apparently, this is according to the ESPN article, the league apparently wants 14 teams to make the playoffs. And so right now we're at what, 8? Is it, let's say there's 3. So I think it's 5 per league now, I think 5 or 6 per league.
Well, how many divisions are there now in baseball? Isn't it 4?
We could have looked all this up ahead of time.
That's so much less fun.
I know. Well, do it. I'm gonna here look at it right now. But so give me 1 second.
The one thing I'd say while you look, the one thing I'd say, kind of circling back to your point around how the difference between the two sides is, the owners have a relatively small circle of people who basically think and have a similar, needs in life and what their goals are, while a players union has more people just on numbers and a wildly divergent needs set coming into that larger number. So they're pretty dramatically different what it's like to organize 30 mega rich and 3,000, 4,000 players in an ecosystem.
Yeah, because it's not just this doesn't just affect Major League Baseball, mind you. There's a whole minor league system, and yes, it's different. But the issues with regard to when minor league players can come up and all of that are part of the CBA. So, because we didn't do our homework ahead of time, I now have the answer. So there are 3 divisions in each league. And then there are 5 playoff teams in each league, so that's 10. And so what baseball wants to do is put 2 more teams in each league to have 7, and then that would give a bye to the number 1 team in the American League and in the National League. The owners want that. I don't necessarily think the union would be opposed to that, but there's a money issue to be negotiated there. And then, they are talking about, obviously, arbitration changes, amateur draft changes. Baseball is, I mentioned this with Corey Seager. Baseball teams are famous for manipulating service times. And what I mean by that, like what the Dodgers did to Corey Seager, is there's a certain, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there's a certain number of days that equal a good year in Major League Baseball. And so what teams are famous for doing is they will take these minor leaguers right up to the day before they get a good year and then send them back to the minors. And then the net effect of that is that the team gets one more year of control over the players. And so the players union, if they're smart, will want to do something about that. Now, teams will always manipulate that. They'll just keep players in the minors longer. So the ultimate goal, I think, probably is to eliminate 1 year of arbitration, which is what I said earlier. So there are some issues out there to negotiate. Where does this all end up? It's really too hard to tell. My feeling, my gut feel is that they'll probably get a deal done and not miss games this time, because I just don't think the owners they really want to have another season destroyed. It would be a horrible marketing tool to have 2 out of the last 3 seasons be ruined by various problems, especially labor strife. And so I tend to think this is probably going to get done with the owners maybe giving a little bit more than what they normally would.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll be talking about this more because we're at the beginning of a process here, obviously. So there'll be much more news and information to come. As of right now, you're not going to have off-season baseball hot stove stuff to pay attention to. So this is the only story in baseball right now.
Yeah, and that's kind of a bummer because the hot stove is always a lot of fun. But what I failed to mention is the other couple issues. Designated hitter. The players are all for the designated hitter rule. I'm not sure the fans are. I mean, as a National League fan, I hate the designated hitter rule personally, but the players want that because that gives more people jobs. Older players who otherwise can't play in the field. And so the players want that. The owners may or may not want that. And then the real money thing here is the luxury tax threshold. So let me explain what a hard cap versus a soft cap is and what this luxury cap is. The NFL has a hard cap. What I mean by a hard cap is that there is a number above which, for no reason at all, for any reason, the teams cannot spend more than this per year. Period. Dot. The end. No matter what they do. A soft cap is a number that's a cap, but there are excuses and reasons why teams can go above it. The NBA has this. There's a cap, but there's bird rights, and there's all sorts of other rules about what teams can spend and whatnot, so the cap isn't a hard number. Baseball doesn't have any cap, but the luxury tax line serves as a soft cap. Because what the luxury tax means is you hit a certain number, and above that you have to pay a tax based on how far above the line you go. And so what we've had in the past several years is that the big money teams, Yankees, to a lesser extent the Yankees now, but the big money teams, the Cubs have been way over it. The Dodgers were humongously over the cap last year. The Red Sox do it. The Yankees to a lesser extent now. So the big money teams can go over the cap because they can afford it, whereas the Milwaukee Brewers of the world and teams that are in like financial distress, like the Miami Marlins, just can't do it, or their owners are too cheap to do it. And so what the players will want is to lower the luxury cap, and the owners will want to keep it high because again, any luxury tax or cap is really just an excuse to protect owners from themselves. So that's the other thing that'll be the major negotiating point is where will the luxury tax end up? And we'll see. Who knows?
And the top of the league, the Yankees of the world, the big markets, have been more conservative, really, over the last 5 years since the last contract. So I think when you see the baby Steinbrenners start to balk at the luxury tax, that you probably there's a conversation to be had there about if it's in the right level.
Yeah, and what people need to understand is the way baseball's luxury tax works is the tax gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more years in a row you're over the cap. And so even like the
compound
Dodgers
interest.
are probably yeah, that's right. Only you have a variable rate.
Yeah.
And the rate keeps going up. And so I think probably from a money standpoint, probably the Dodgers are probably the richest team in baseball in terms of their ownership structure and whatnot. Even the Dodgers will all these teams will the term you hear is they will reset the cap, and what that means is the Yankees, the Dodgers, they go right up to the line in which they're really paying a ton of interest. They've got the 33% credit card, at this point, and then they'll go 1 year where they're barely under the cap, and then that resets the number, and then that gives them 4 or 5 more years so they can build up again. And that's what these teams have been doing. Now the other side of this, which the players union have made known that they want to do something about, is that there's been a lot of teams that have gone the other direction and burned their payroll to the ground. And part of that is team building. The Astros did this several years ago when the cheating Astros, sorry, I meant to use their full name. The cheating Astros burned their payroll to the ground several years ago when they got a new owner and rebuilt their whole farm system. But then you have teams like Miami. Before the Derek Jeter time, they just had a horrible owner who didn't want to spend money. The Pittsburgh Pirates have a terrible owner who doesn't want to spend money. And so the players may want to see some sort of salary floor, that says to keep these teams competitive, you have to spend this much. Because like this past year, like the left side of the Dodgers infield was more than the entire payroll of 3 or 4 teams. Seriously. And so that's not equitable really in terms of competitive balance, but more importantly, the players on the Pirates and the Marlins of the world are making relative peanuts. And so I think the players will also want to see a salary cap floor if they have to give on the luxury tax at the top. So I think that's another big issue.
Well, also I think they should definitely, and the owner should actually consider that, because just like you talked about the luxury tax being a check on themselves and their peers in that ownership circle, the floor should be as well, because when these sort of almost rogue owners do the slash and burn on their roster, it's got very negative consequences for lots of aspects of the league: competitive balance, optics, harmony within the ownership group. So it behooves the owners to consider that as another check on themselves, quite frankly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just from a basic fairness standpoint, you've got some owners spending, just a huge amount of money, and others are not. And while this is not like a true Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto style profit sharing like the NFL has, where every dime is shared, or most dimes are shared, there are some income sharing aspects to baseball where they're basically writing checks to these teams at the lower end of the revenue scale. And those teams, again, it's it's a handful. The Pirates and the Marlins are the two probably worst of the bunch, but the Rays have been there. Other teams have been there. And at least in football, the owners are required to spend all that money. You don't have like some owner spending nothing on their payroll in the NFL. In baseball, they're taking the free money and they're putting it in their pocket. And so if I was a big spending owner, like the Steinbrenners of the world, I would be hugely irritated. I had to do that. And these owners don't have to have some sort of minimum salary cap, in exchange for the privilege. So yeah, I think you're right in saying that the lead owners in baseball, if I were one of them, I would maybe want to bake that into this because the big owners are never going to be anywhere near the lower cap anyway. It's not going to affect them. The Yankees, Dodgers, Red Sox are never going to be down there. It doesn't matter. So what that really has the effect of doing is getting the bad owners in line, basically. And I would be in for that if I was an owner.
Yeah, it seems like something that should happen. All right, well, we'll see. I'm sure in 2 weeks there will be updates. Even if the updates is that the stalemate is growing colder. Which,
The update is that there's no update.
yeah,
Because don't forget, when it comes to negotiations like this, deadlines matter a lot. Even if they're artificially created deadlines. So the union and the owners are not just gonna all of a sudden come to an agreement 2 weeks from now. These things have a way of resolving themselves at the last minute because of deadlines, and so don't expect this to happen anytime soon. I would expect maybe into January before we really hear real progress.
yeah, I would guess that's true. The next story, we don't often have the opportunity to talk about major franchises being sold, and we have one going on now where the Pittsburgh Penguins of the National Hockey League are being sold, which I find kind of an interesting angle to this. The Fenway Sports Group, which of course owned the Boston Red Sox, among some other, I think, soccer properties, and are looking to build these portfolios. I think we talked about these portfolios a couple weeks ago when we talked about that one rapscallion owner. So here we are again. This is a really fascinating story. One, it sort of sets some valuations around NHL teams. The reporting is that they were valued at $845 million, and that the sale is going to be up north side of $900 million, which was a little surprising given some other facts around more original six teams, being above $1 billion in valuation. But still, a very interesting sale. So, Steve, before I talk a little bit about Mario Lemieux through this from a personal narrative, any observations from where the valuations of these teams are at?
Yeah, I think that's remarkably high, and a credit to the NHL. I don't think even 4 or 5 years ago anything but the largest, most popular teams in the NHL would have gotten anywhere close to that. And I think it primarily revolves around television money. Because if you go back about a decade, the NHL was almost off TV entirely. They were on like the Outdoor Network.
Yeah.
Wasn't it the Outdoor Network, which is an
Yes.
NBC Universal owned property, but it was buried in channel 800 and cable, and nobody knew where it was. And even the Stanley Cup playoffs were not broadcast on, all 7 games were not broadcast on network television. That has changed a lot in recent years, and I think now they have they're back on ESPN. The Stanley Cup playoffs are more available on networks now, and I think that has a whole lot to do with the valuation of these teams. But there is a pretty wide disparity, I think, in hockey that is not there in other sports. And let me just give you guys some valuation info. This is from sportsnet.ca, dated October 14, 2021, so before the sale. But they are citing Sportico. So the site is Sportsnet citing Sportico. NFL average franchise value $3.5 billion, NBA $2.3 billion, Major League Baseball $2.2 billion, National Hockey League $930 million, and soccer, amazingly, $550 million, which has got to be wrong. Either that or there's one very valuable team. That's what Sportico says is the average valuation of teams. The valuation all the yeah. And so what that's basically saying is the Pittsburgh Pirates are sort of average, which surprises me greatly. I don't get it. Because the Pirates aren't they an original 6 or
They're not.
original
No,
8 or whatever?
no. But here's what I think is interesting about this. One, it does show you that the size of the market matters. It's really interesting, two sides of this coin, right? So, one, there is a market size steel ceiling for a region like Pittsburgh, right? It is maxed out its ability. The fact that it's going to be at $950 million, by all when it's all said and done, is because of how successful they've been. They have a 14-year sellout streak. They have ginormous local ratings, the number one local TV ratings of any NHL team in the entire league. All of the things that you need to do to maximize profit, be successful. Oh, and by the way, win massively on the ice
They've done.
Yes, which they've done, are all in place, and they're still, kind of not even scratching that top tier. And the only explanation is ultimately the size of the market.
Yeah, so here's some other numbers for you. The original 6 is what I was trying to say and screwed it up. The original 6 teams, the Rangers, Canadiens, Montreal Canadiens, Chicago Blackhawks, Boston Bruins. Rangers, 1.87 billion. Canadiens, 1.5 billion. Blackhawks, 1.56 million. And it goes sort of down from there. The Toronto Maple Leafs, which were an original 6 team as well, they have the highest. They're pegged at about $2 billion.
Can I just break in real quick on them?
Yeah,
because it's fascinating. So, top valued team in the league makes sense in a lot of ways. Toronto, Canada, huge, blah blah blah. They haven't won a championship since 1967, I believe. So, just think about how amazing that is. That the highest value is what we might say that is like the Cleveland Indians / Guardians or some of these other teams that have been on like multiple decade, 50+ year championships droughts and blow away the field in your valuation. That's pretty remarkable.
Well, I think that's just a testament to how popular hockey is in the Canadian market.
Yeah. And look
more
at
than anything.
Like Edmonton on that list is another good example of the strength of the Canadian market.
Yeah, I didn't get to that. Edmonton, they've valued at $1.16 billion. With Edmonton, it's for God's Jesus. But just notice that $2 billion is probably less than every NFL team.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. And so that's sort of where hockey's pegged. And what this also tells you is that the soccer number, the 550 for MLS, it's probably the LA team. I can't remember what their name is. There's probably a couple MLS teams that are valued at 600 or 700 million, and the rest of them are at like 100 million, or 200 million, maybe at most.
There are also less franchises to average out.
Yes, that's also true. So the variance the delta is gonna be pretty great in that. No, I think you've kind of said it, which is, Pittsburgh is an outstanding sports market. As you said, they've sold out every game for, what did you say, 14 years?
Yeah.
The Steelers have a tremendous response. The people somehow have supported the Pittsburgh Pirates forever, in spite of the Pirates ownership group just being a train wreck, of cheapskates. And so it's a very good market, but it's a limited market. Pittsburgh is a small town. It's a blue-collar town. There's not a ton of money. It's not L.A., or New York, where there's a bunch of billionaires around and all of that. It's a blue-collar town. And so I think from that respect, the market, the money that people will spend on the team is more limited than in some other markets, which is going to ultimately affect value. And the fact that it's $900 million is a testament to, one, the increased television revenue, and two, just what a great sports market Pittsburgh is, even with its limited size and scope.
Now, I hinted at this. Now, let me preface this by saying that I probably hate no professional franchise more than the Pittsburgh Penguins. And if
I didn't realize that was the team you hated.
Oh, yeah. And if I had to put my Mount Rushmore of most hated professional athletes, Mario Lemieux is in granite. So let me preface this to say, but the career of Mario Lemieux is absolutely kind of crazy. Well, one, he plays, retires multiple championships, battled cancer, and came back and won a championship. Um, and leaves as maybe top 3 player to ever play his game. He leaves. Him and his business partner save the Penguins from bankruptcy after he leaves. They save the team. He goes and finds himself the second coming of himself with Sidney Crosby. Cements more championships, huge success on the ice. Builds, and he was not a. I'm not saying he was a chief financier, but he was not a riding sidecar here. He was driving a lot of this process. Now he gets to this point where not only is he going to cash out huge, a conquering hero for the franchise, and like a demigod in every way you can calculate, he also maintains partial ownership, which essentially in this kind of scenario means he gets a legacy board seat on the controlling board of the Penguins. We talk about athletes and their business decisions and their like kind of long career, the ones that kind of, go on and have these kind of post playing time careers. That is remarkable.
And some retirement Social Security in the form of annual distributions.
Yeah, right.
For doing nothing.
For his grandkids.
Which is basically what that. Yeah. First of all, Wayne Gretzky's probably the best hockey player ever, at least acknowledged. Mario Lemieux, who's the third?
Well, I mean, yeah, you'd go back to the Orr Hall. There's probably, there's a Ken Dryden. You'd look. I mean, if you're a real historian, you'd probably start to look at the '60s and '70s era, for greatest of all time. But you could probably put Jaromir Jagr there on stats alone. So you start to get into that kind of conversation. But yeah, there's no conversation that he isn't in the top 5, and the only reason you'd say he isn't in the top 2 to 3 is recency bias.
Yeah. Okay. I was just curious. But anyway, I think it's a testament to. I think because I agree, I'm no hockey fan. I mean, I'll watch the 7th game of the Stanley Cup Finals, and that's about it. But if you've been paying attention at all, you'll see what Chris said about what Mario Lemieux has done is right. He did rescue the Pittsburgh Pirates or Penguins. He did do it himself. Almost no player is very good at ownership and management. Look at like John Elway. He hasn't done anything, all that substantial with the Broncos, in spite of the fact that he's one of the greatest quarterbacks ever. Because they're players. They're not managers and leaders and business guys. Mario Lemieux has defied all expectations. Look at like Magic Johnson. The greatest point guard ever. You could argue he's maybe the greatest player ever. With apologies to the Jordan fans out there. He was a horrible coach. He was a terrible general manager of the Lakers. Horrible. And so Lemieux is maybe unique in that respect, in that he was one of the all-time great hockey players, and he was a great owner, and he did it himself. And so it's been amazing. And he battled cancer. Like you said, don't forget about the cancer on top of all this. So it's a testament to him, and I'm happy to see he certainly deserves to cash out, and I'm glad he did. But it's the valuation is what interests me most. In what we've seen is that Toronto is the highest valued team, and they're probably lower. They're valued lower than every NFL team. That just shows you where the hierarchy really is.
If you take everything that we've talked about the Pittsburgh Penguins and just swapped out Chicago for Pittsburgh, its valuation would be almost double.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Chicago's a much bigger city, much bigger market, much more prominent market in the national discussion. The Chicago Blackhawks are probably a higher profile team, I would say, for non-hockey fanatics like Chris. Chris is a pretty big hockey fan. So yeah, no, I think so. I think if you throw Blackhawks in there, you're talking $2 billion valuation probably.
Yeah. So good stuff there. One last story that is sort of got, it's a good last story in that it's actually super interesting. We could have led with it on many show weeks.
We probably would have.
Yeah, but it also does provide a few LOLs. And that is what is happening with these the coaching carousel. Let me say the mid-season coaching carousel in men's college football. It is crazy town. Who's leaving? Where they're going? And more importantly, the kinds of deals that are making them abandon their team mid-season.
Yeah, holy Christ. I mean, Lincoln Riley. My God, this is, there's been two of them, Lincoln Riley and Mike Kelly, So Lincoln Riley, and this is, like you said, the season isn't even over. Mike Riley, like, abandons Oklahoma Sooners and moves over to USC. And
they haven't even started to name the bowl games yet.
No, I know, and he's just gone. And I heard, one of the players quoted on, I think it was Brady Quinn and LeVar Arrington's radio show on Fox Sports, how Lincoln Riley came in and said, all these great things about USC, and I'm here for the long haul and everything. And he said, he told us that last week, in Oklahoma. But just listen to this. So you wonder why some of these coaches aren't moving to the NFL. Why wouldn't Lincoln Riley want to go coach like the whoever, the Tennessee Titans or somebody? Well, this is why. Here's his contract. $110 million. And the term is, I think, 10 years. USC is buying both of his houses in Norman for $500,000 over the asking price each, meaning $1 million. They're buying a $6 million house for him in LA, and they're giving him unlimited use of a private jet, not just for him for business, but for his family, 24/7, totally on call at all times for them. That's Lincoln Riley's contract. There is no coach in the NFL that has a contract like that. The NFL teams are not buying houses for anybody. Yes, the Bill Belichick's of the world, ton of money, certainly by regular person standards. But NFL coaches don't make this. $110 million, buying 3 houses for him, private jet, that doesn't happen. And Mike Kelly doesn't have quite the same sweetheart deal. But what Mike Kelly was the coach of Notre Dame, who I think is their winningest coach of all time now, even over Lou Holtz and some of the other coaches in yesteryear.
Wasn't he still chasing Newt Rockne?
Maybe, you might be right, maybe. But I know he had passed Lou Holtz and some others. And so he goes to LSU in the blink of an eye in the middle of the season. And Notre Dame is in the playoff hunt right now. It doesn't matter. Gone. Boom. And he's got similar money, which is averaging around $10 million a year. And he's got not unlimited use of a private jet, but he's got, I think it was 50 hours of private jet time. These just aren't numbers that are going to be made by NFL coaches. And it's just, crazy time. So is Lincoln Riley really that good of a coach? No. Here's the thing. USC has the Reggie Bush scandal destroyed USC football. It ruined their recruiting class. It ruined the number of scholarships they had. It ruined their reputation. The city of LA kind of moved on. They never recovered from it. And, of course, ironically, the USC never really did anything wrong there except maybe turn their head a little bit when a bunch of agents bought Reggie Bush's family house. And meanwhile, you have Penn State, who actively sanctioned the rape of children in the football facility, and the leadership of Penn State tried to cover it up, and they got, comparatively speaking, much less than USC did. I think that's disgusting. But beyond that, so USC really, and they've gone through a string of bummer coaches. So they needed to make a splash, and they need to get someone who can recruit. Because I don't think Lincoln Riley's a great coach. I think he's a great recruiter. That's true for almost every college team. So they had to really roll out the red carpet to get the guy to leave Oklahoma and come to California.
First of all, one of the things that jumps off the page to me when I look at the details of that contract is, why does he need 2 homes in Norman, Oklahoma?
Yeah, I didn't really understand that either. Norman?
Yeah.
Norman's about the size of a postage stamp
Yeah.
if you've never been there.
What do you two houses? I mean, whatever. I'm not begrudging people how they spend their money, and having multiple houses is fun if you can swing it. So it's not even. I'm not even making it a class thing as much as I'm just making it like, do you like really? So that
Maybe it's like one for his family and one for his girlfriend or something.
yeah,
Who knows?
yeah, two family Riley. But the totally unsubstantiated. We're just pulling stuff out of the air.
It's a joke, people. It's a joke.
And then also, are there rules that govern how these guys can use these private jet access for recruiting?
Well, for recruiting, yes. There's not going to be any rules about the university. Maybe there should be. Especially USC, it's a private, it's not a public university. So it's ultimately just a contract thing. But recruiting, yeah, there probably are.
Like, can he take prospective players on the private jet? Can he fly coaches and scouts to be first at a, somewhere? Can he use it to leapfrog? Because a lot of this is how these coaches and scouting teams battle each other for access. Well, if unlimited private jet, you're going to be at the front of any line.
Yeah, I think the problem is going to come in flying players around. The coaches, yeah, I don't think that's going to be a problem. But the players, yes, I think that is a problem. So I think this is truly just, I want to send my family on a vacation to South Africa. Let's take the USC jet to go do that. I think that's really what it is, more than anything. Because like Lincoln Riley isn't going to send the wide receiver scout to Missouri on his private jet. That dude's going to have to take United Airlines, because I've seen him. You've probably seen him in the airports and stuff. These guys wearing the OU tracksuits or whatever, hauling a backpack around. I mean, that's how most scouts go. So, no, I think it's a problem for players, not coaches. So
be interesting to watch, because all coaches will gain every advantage in recruiting because, as Steve said, head coaches are judged as much about program building and recruiting as they are, third and four decisions and, mid-season. So, that it'll be, how, if that provides any advantage. The other thing I think we have to mention here is that, and yes, you could say it's just optics, but perception is generally what drives everything. And the idea that a coach can get this kind of a contract that would make the NFL blush, it just opens up a lot of questions about the economics of college football, and then the drastic inequality. And inequality, in terms of, do the players get nothing, et cetera, but also inequality in coach to coach, the field, there's just, when you see this, it just calls into question any kind of, woe is me talk that anyone should come up with here, and just shows it's a broken system.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Mike Kelly's contract may be even worse. There's not he doesn't have all the incentives, the houses and the private jet that Lincoln Riley does, but he's got contract incentives that take it up to like $135 million, like easy to reach contract incentives. And listen, I mean, LSU's a public institution. I really kind of have a problem with this to a certain extent because while USC is a private institution, but they're taking federal money too. It's not all totally private money, but LSU's the lead public university in the state of Louisiana, and they're spending at least some of this is taxpayer money. All of it is ultimately public money, and they're spending it on a football coach.
I mean, yes, I totally agree. I mean, think of it this way too. Here we are, if Kelly hits certain incentives, as you say, probably are pretty realistic, let's call them that, to hit.
It's like playoff eligibility. Yeah. It's nothing that's all that.
It's why they hired him, basically. So, and that's what, let's just call it a 20 million bonus or 10 million bonus. That's a public university. The cancer research lab at the medical school down the block has to fight, beg, scrap for internal resources and go out and get federal grants, private grants, do all these things, to raise research money for cancer, whatever. Put your thing in there, and we're sitting here talking about $15 million bonus for a college football coach at a public university. Like at some point,
Yeah.
it's a value statement.
Yeah, no, I agree, and you and I don't normally agree on things like value statements, but because think it, 15 million could send a lot of kids to college. It can improve the quality of the academic experience. It can improve dormitories, and at some point, I think these universities need to remember why they're there. And this is sort of the big problem I've had with college athletics in general, and especially college basketball and football. We're spending so much money on this. Well, the mission of the university is lost. They're there to educate people. It's not there to make money off of football teams. Don't forget why you're there. And these coaches' contracts. I bet you. I would assume that Mike Kelly's probably the highest paid employee in the state of Louisiana.
That's a good way to
Right?
put it. Yeah.
I'm sure he is. In terms of I'm talking public employees in the state of Louisiana, it's probably him. And while certainly we all enjoy football and all of that, and I think Chris and I have said on multiple occasions that both he and I have lost a lot of interest in college football over the years, and part of it is because for these reasons, because it sort of disgusts me what college football has become, and you forget about the amateur nature of it, and it's supposed to be the secondary mission of the university, and the lead mission is to educate students, and then I'd argue the second mission, as Chris said, is to do research. And in the meantime, we're paying a football coach $110 million. Even USC again is a private institution, but it's still taking federal dollars. And the mission of USC is to educate people, not to put on a football team. And so, a big part of it, I think, people need to wake up and realize that I think the football program in particular, and to a lesser extent basketball, in the NCAA has gotten way out of control.
Yes, and the USC or any private institution at that level is an interesting example to what you just said. But they're not. Yes, they're private. They, all that, but that doesn't mean, Here's how it connects. Every year, Congress and the executive branch debate a budget, right? Blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to get all schoolhouse rock on you, but a budget is produced. Part of that, those discussions are how much we allocate to the National Science Foundation, which funds a lot of this kind of stuff across everything from astrophysics to mental health. So USC knows that they can gouge that federal pot for those kind of NSF or Health and Human Services, all those federal agencies that fund that kind of research, and not have to put internal resources towards that because they know they got a spigot from the federal government about those things. Steve and I could debate whether we should have that or not or whatever. I'm sort of neither here nor there. It's available to them. They are optimized to receive it. So they can go and make these kinds of decisions to throw just buckets of money because they know they've got those federal spigots that will keep those research labs humming. And then, oh, by the way, when something does emerge, they take all the victory laps.
Yeah, and it's certainly another podcast to debate that. But generally speaking, people need to understand these federal budgets, all these spending bills, and I venture to guess you and I probably disagree on that. I'm not going to debate it here, but people need to understand that when the federal government passes something like an infrastructure bill, which they did, a month ago or whatever, it's most of that money isn't accounted for yet. It's what they're doing is they're just sort of taking a giant leaf blower and blowing money all over the place, and they're going to give $100 million to this and $100 million to that, and nobody really knows where it goes. And so, yes, you at the USCs of the world are lined up to get that kind of money from things like the Federal Science Foundation, but there's a million other programs where they get federal money, and so they can afford to throw $110 million at Lincoln Riley. But again, I think they need to remember, ultimately, the purpose of the university is not to put on a football team. It's to educate students, and at some level, I think some of these resources need to be directed away from making coaches some of the richest people in the country, and why not improve the educational quality of the university and bring in more students?
Totally agree. And, it's not a far stretch to say that, you and I with our federal tax dollars are helping to subsidize Lincoln Riley's personal jet.
Absolutely. Yes. Even though it's a private university, it doesn't matter. And I don't think the public understands that. Private just means it's not run by the state of California. It doesn't mean they're not getting a huge amount of state and federal dollars.
Yes.
And a lot of the state money is really federal money.
Yeah. So there you go. So we started with laughing. We end with crying. So there we go. Some good meaty stories today. Steve, I think you're probably in a place where you have more interesting hog styles, just given the state of the on the field product. But what's coming up?
Can you believe it? Washington Redskins, because it will always be the Redskins to me, are in a place where they control their own destiny. So yes, it is certainly more interesting than the normal out of contention grind that we do. It's a bit more exciting. We are doing two Hogstye shows a week, game recap, game previews. We have all of our regular written content. Rick Snyder is doing 2 Seasons of Discontent shows a week, and he's got his YouTube page, which is Rick Snyder's Washington. Check that out. And we have all of our regular written content.
There you go. And you have a 33.3% chance to be discussing a playoff game later on this winter.
Amazing. Who'd have thunk it?
No, not me. All right, so we will see you in 2 weeks.